to our president, Brother Naim. All right, next I'd like to invite Professor Christian Anu, the Pro Vice Chancellor of Nottingham UK campus, to give a word or two. Round of applause.
Thank you. I guess I can't have done too badly if you've invited me back to speak again after my previous performance in November. This time it will be brief. It's a great pleasure to be here to introduce Datuk Paddie Bowie, who is probably my oldest friend in Malaysia. And I mean oldest as in for the longest time, in case anyone thinks I'm being insulting. But we worked very closely together about 11 years ago when this campus was first established. And we've stayed close friends ever since, so it's particularly nice to be here. Datuk Bowie came to Malaysia, I think it's now about 55 years ago. When she came, she was coming for a couple of years, and somehow she never quite managed to get back. And in that sense, I think there's a very strong degree of commonality between Nottingham and between Datuk Bowie. Both originate in the UK, and both are now very clearly Malaysian. But retaining strong ties. Datuk Bowie didn't actually study at Nottingham University. That's probably the only oversight in her career. She was educated in Manchester and Oxford. She did, however, marry somebody who graduated from Nottingham, so it's always reassuring. She moved out to Malaysia via Singapore. As I said, she's been in Malaysia for some 55 years. She worked for a long time for Shell, and on the main board. When she left Shell, she set up her own company, Paddie, and Dairy and Bahad, which she still runs, which is still very, very active. She's also worked with the Economist Intelligence Unit throughout the ASEAN region as an organiser and a speaker. She's got a list of appointments and achievements that is far too long for me to go through. So I will just draw out one or two key points. As a Malaysian citizen and in recognition of the contribution she's made to Malaysia, she was given the title Datuk by the King of Malaysia in 1996, and she was also given the title of OBE by the Queen of England in, I think, about 2000, if I'm not wrong. So she's been honoured in both countries. And in 2009 she received an honorary degree from the University of Nottingham. So she is now officially one of our graduates. And I'm only disappointed that I've been called to a meeting, which means I can't stay and listen to this lecture, because I know from past experience that Dr. Bowie is a great speaker and will offer some fascinating insights. I'm sure you'll enjoy this afternoon. And therefore it's a great pleasure for me to hand over to a Nottingham University graduate, Datuk Paddie Bowie, to speak to you.
Yes, we are very dear friends. We were both midwives at the birth of this campus and at the Nottingham University when it was still in town. And we've been close, dear friends ever since. Can you hear me? No, you can't. Is that all right? Is that better? Yes. Yes, all right. I can't keep looking out there, but let's hope it works. I hate technology and the technical way of doing it. Let me say a little more about why I'm here. I was that excited schoolgirl on Empire Day in England, waving her Union Jack fervently. And I came out to a British colony called Singapore in those days. The pillboxes were red, the traffic drove on the left, English was spoken, my chartered bank was there, it was very familiar, and I only intended to stay for 2 years. But then I met and married my first husband, and it was a mixed marriage. I've had 2 marriages, both mixed. The first was relatively easy. I married a Sri Lankan. But the second was very difficult because I married a Scotsman. That's the worst kind of mixed marriage. But in Singapore in those days, I had breached the white standard. So I was banned from the British High Commission. I was banned from expatriate homes. I was banned from the expatriate clubs. But of course, things got better later on. On this side of the causeway, Bunny Suffian suffered the same fate, and those who shunned her when she married Suffian lived to regret it because they had to kowtow to the Lord President's wife later on. Now, I'm never obedient. I'm not going to talk about economics. I had written and said I wouldn't because I am a financial virgin. So please forgive me. I'm going to talk about politics. In a country so extraordinary in its politics as Malaysia. But let's count our blessings. Let's look at what's happening in Egypt, or even worse, Libya. And I think you'll probably go home thankful that you were born here. I take it as an opportunity to speak to you, an opportunity for some intellectual streeting. I'm too old to do any other kind of streaking. You see, the OBE to me stands for over bloody 80. Or other people's efforts. I'm also in my anecdotage, so I love telling stories. And I'm going to start with a story about Nottingham. And it's not about Robin Hood, but did you know that Nottingham founded America? Did you know? No, you didn't, did you? No. Well, let me tell you. The first person there was Marco Polo, but he thought he'd arrived at India, which was his destination. So he called the natives of America Red Indians. If you've often wondered why they're called Indians, it was because Marco Polo thought that he was in India, so he didn't settle there. But in 1620, a group of very religious Puritans from Scrooby in Nottingham went down to Plymouth, boarded a ship called the Mayflower, crossed the great Atlantic Ocean, arrived at a strange new country they promptly called New England, founded a very religious colony, so they were called the Pilgrim Fathers. And they also set the Protestant tradition of America, which has produced today the Bible Belt and a man called Obama. That's where it all goes back to. Right, let's go to our serious topic. When Malaysians went abroad for education, tertiary education, the first natural destination was, of course, England, because this was the colonial period and they followed the colonial masters. But their first choice, they went in batches, and the first choice was a place called Nottingham. As a result, Nottingham produced 2 of our kings and 1 prime minister, who is the present one, and many other distinguished persons, including ministers like Datuk retired, with whom you'll be familiar. The second batch went as a man at independence, Queen's Scholars. They all went to Cambridge. Wrong choice, of course. It must have been some obscure colonial officer who misdirected them through down and under. But you had people like Sufyan Tunisma, who founded Bank Negara, Chong Hong Yen, who was a minister, and they all did law at Tit Hall, otherwise Christchurch, in Cambridge, with one exception, the late Chong Hong Yen, who, being custard, went to Edinburgh and did medicine. The third batch went to LSE. People like Asman Mokhtar of Kazama, Asman Yahya, Munir Majid of MAS, and so on. And they kept to these fashions in the choice of university until now, when they just spread anywhere they like. But Nottingham has always had a special place in the Malaysian education saga. You have, for the first Malay that I ever met in Singapore, the very first one, was a dashing prince of hockey, whose name was Aslan Shah, and who had been at Nottingham with my first husband, and together they'd taken a young student team to Paynton in Devon, and they won the All England Championships, this obscure student team. And as you know, Sultan Aslan Shah, to this day, is a great supporter of hockey. He, at that time, was very handsome. Central Casting of Hollywood would give anything for him. The second Malay I ever met was a man called Time Adak, before your time, also handsome and charming. So I formed the impression that all Malay men were devastatingly handsome. I was a romantic young girl, but the illusion lasted only until I crossed the causeway. Now, I won't tell you who I saw. I'd like to compare Malaysia, before we start on the politics, so that you can count your blessings and compare it with what's happening in the Middle East at the moment, with what is aptly called Liberation Square in Cairo, where the protesters, as you know, took to the streets in a political ferment, a revolutionary ferment. Egypt, the oldest government in the world, 7,000 years old, the beating heart of the Arab world. It took them not one day of rage, it took them 18 days to oust the autocratic ruler Mubarak, thereby emancipating 85 million people from the clutches of a latter-day pharaoh, and what they wanted was to replace pharaohism, which was autocratic, military-backed, with a real democratic government. These rulers throughout the Middle East, we include Tunisia, we include Libya, they have been there for 4 decades in power, these aging despots. But there's been a swift transition to democracy under civilian rule in this generation, so that we could, in Malaysia, observe it. What we were seeing was citizen power. All classes, all walks of life, some Christians, Coptic Christians, some atheists, some Muslims, the pious and the secular ladies, some of them veiled and some of them not veiled, all walks of life. 60%